Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to be part of virtual ICMPC. My name is Kai Siedenburg. I'm head of the Music Perception and Processing Lab at the University of Oldenburg in Germany. And today I present joint work with Kirsten Goldmann and Steven van der Paa. What we do here is a sort of case study where we use the music of Johann Sebastian Bach and specifically his Art of the Fugue to look into musical scene analysis, and more specifically musical scene analysis of two types of groups of listeners, namely younger normal hearing listeners and older hearing aid users. If you're interested in the study, you can look it up. It's already published. Was published in April this year in Frontiers. As a background, one could say that auditory scene analysis organizes sound mixtures into auditory events and streams. And in the case of polyphonic music, this allows listeners to track distinct musical voices or follow a melody in the midst of an accompaniment. And music perception research has been, of course, aware of the critical importance of scene analysis for a long time, but there are actually relatively few studies on scene analysis in ecological scenarios. So as a theoretical point of departure, we here revisit David Huron's classic paper, Tone and Voice, from 2001 and his 2016 book on voice leading. In these writings, Huron delineated that a central goal of voice leading is to facilitate, or in a sense simplify, the listener's mental construction of coherent auditory scenes. And he also described the implicit pleasures derived from parsing a musical scene as being driven by the multiplicity of concurrent sound sources. The more, the better, in a sense. He also outlined several principles of ASA, of which we today focus on two. We don't have time to go through all of them, but just look at two principles. And these are the limited density principle, where he states that the tracking of voices in polyphonic music becomes difficult when the number of voices exceeds 3. And the second principle that we consider today is the timbral differentiation principle, where he stated that timbrally heterogeneous mixtures are easier to parse than homogeneous ones. In the study, we are also interested in listeners beyond the young normal hearing suspects, right? So our question today is also, which roles do forms of oftentimes age-related hearing impairment play in listening to these types of musical textures? So to exaggerate a little bit, the question could be, how much Bach do older hearing impaired listeners still hear? These are the central hypotheses that we test in this study. First, the limited density principle, stating that the tracking of voices is difficult when the number of voices exceeds 3. Second, the timbral differentiation principle, stating that timbrally heterogeneous mixtures are easier to parse than homogeneous ones, and I've mentioned these two already. Third, we test whether hearing impaired listeners or hearing aid users exhibit lower accuracies compared to normal hearing listeners. And fourth, we consider whether hearing aids help with music listening. And we do this with short excerpts from Johann Sebastian Bach's Art of the Fugue. Let's jump right into our setup of the experiment. Listeners were seated in a lab with a short reverberation time, so around 300 milliseconds, and sounds were presented from spatially separated loudspeakers as indicated in this picture. Heterogeneous instrumentations would consist of a flute, a violin, a French horn, and a bassoon, and homogeneous instrumentations would consist of a violin, a viola, and a violoncello, so basically a string quartet. And then the experiment was constructed in the way that hearing aid users would do the experiment once with hearing aids on and once without. And the data were collected in 2 separate sessions on 2 separate days. And of course, the order of the sessions was counterbalanced across subjects. And similarly, normal hearing listeners would do the experiment once with sounds in their original form and once with a sort of low-pass filter applied, which is, in a sense, the simplest way to emulate elevated thresholds for hearing impaired listeners. And there the filter roll-off started at 1 kilohertz with a slope of minus 10 dB per octave. So in a sense, simulating a moderate form of hearing impairment, which also our hearing aid users on average were characterized by. This is the manipulation that we inserted in our sound stimuli. So all the stimuli started with a cue, as indicated here, and then listeners were instructed to follow this cue and say whether there was an amplitude modulation inserted in the cued voice or not. And this amplitude modulation looks like this. If you focus on it, if you zoom in, we had 8 Hertz of amplitude modulation and 65% of amplitude modulation depth. And then for you to get an impression of the basic task, our listeners first underwent a training phase with single instruments and then followed by the main experiment. And here's how this all sounds like in the heterogeneous condition. The correct response would, of course, be yes. And now to the different conditions of the main experiment. Correct response would be, in the 3-voice case, it sounds like this. Again, a yes. And finally, the 4-voice case. It should be difficult according to Euron. Correct response would be no. Okay, so our participants were initially 21 young normal hearing subjects and 14 old hearing impaired participants with average gold MSI scores, I would say. So amateur musicians, you could classify them as. And of course, initially we had planned to recruit another group of older normal hearing participants, but finally we only managed to test 4 of these until the pandemic hit in. So this is sort of our results until that state, until February 2020. These participants needed to fulfill a 80% criterion in the training that I just presented to you, so the single instrument cases, which was completed by 19 young normal hearing participants and 11 old hearing impaired participants. And of these 11 older participants, 3 performed at chance during the experiment, so we took them out of the analysis, and these 3 participants can be seen here in the form of these white dots. So this unfortunately left us with 8 older hearing aid users, but the pandemic didn't allow for any more participants. Okay. And here are our main results. The individual numbers, which look sort of like breadcrumbs, correspond to individual participants. And let's go through these effects in detail. You find all the details regarding the statistical model, the mixed effects model, in the paper. So we find a main effective group, of course. Young normal hearing listeners are on average better compared to older hearing impaired listeners. The number of voices, of course, plays a role. It's easier for 2 compared to 3 compared to 4. But if we look at the young normal hearing folks here, there's quite some variance, but performance is above chance, even for the condition of 4 voices, right? So this, in a sense, refines or updates, informs Huron's hypothesis on the limited density principle. We find, of course, an effect of instrumentation. So here on top you have the heterogeneous instrumentation. On the bottom you have the homogeneous instrumentation. It's less of an effect for the hearing aid users compared to the normal hearing folks. And most interestingly, we find that there's a 3-way interaction between the group of listeners, the number of voices, and the instrumentation, which means that young normal hearing listeners benefit from heterogeneous instrumentation, so in these cases, for 3 and 4 voices, but older hearing impaired listeners do not benefit in these conditions. Right? So this is a case where the cues cannot be fully utilized by older hearing impaired users, older hearing impaired listeners. Quite surprising to us was that we in fact did not find effects of hearing aids or low pass filtering. So here you see individual data for young normal hearing listeners, and here you see older hearing aid users, and both do not show any systematic relationship with regards to low pass filtering or the usage of hearing aids. For younger normal hearing listeners, we did, however, find a learning effect. So here you can see that the solid lines correspond to listeners who first did the condition with the original sounds, and they all more or less go up. And the dashed lines correspond to listeners who first did the low pass condition, and they all sort of go up. So that means learning, but not the filtering, did play a role for younger normal hearing listeners. So to conclude, we were in fact able to confirm that there is certainly an effect of the number of voices, but we did not observe a sharp cutoff at 3 voices. So we even found that it's okay to have scene analysis with 4 voices, and in particular so for timbrally heterogeneous mixtures. This brings us to hypothesis 2. So we found a clear effect of timbral differentiation, in the sense that heterogeneous mixtures were easier to parse than homogeneous ones. The third hypothesis was also confirmed in the sense that hearing impaired listeners or hearing aid users exhibited lower accuracies compared to normal hearing listeners on average. But curiously, hearing aids didn't help with music listening. That's it. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your questions.